Welcome to Fast Politics, Joyce Vance.
Thank you for having me.
I love you. Like I know
It's so mutual.
people find it very annoying when I say how much I love the guests, so I won't say it. But you're a person who a lot of people love because you're smart, you have had these really important jobs in government, and you also are fucking brave. So explain to us what this book is. It's a little bit different. It's not a Trump book. It's something completely different. Talk to us about Giving Up is Unforgivable.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I deserve the introduction, but thank you. I bet everybody remembers that moment after the election when Kamala Harris lost and people seemed ready to just give up. They had given it everything that they had. It hadn't worked. People were gobsmacked by that. My fear in that moment was that it would become easy to walk away from democracy as a failed experiment. And I thought the consequences of walking away, especially with the specter of a second Trump presidency, were very dire. And so I began looking for points in our history where it looked like the rule of law had just not been up to the task of preserving democracy. And the more I thought about that, I thought, there's a powerful lesson here. When you're in a moment where one or two institutions that we're used to taking for granted, when those institutions fail, other institutions step up. And so there are, for example, issues involving the Dred Scott case, which is an old Supreme Court case that reached the regrettable conclusion that Black people weren't American citizens. It was a horrible moment in American history. It took a bloody civil war to transform the country. But ultimately, Congress saw fit to make clear through legislation that, yes, Black people were not only citizens, they had the right to vote, to sue. They had a right to equal treatment. And so the point that I wanted to make was, in the moment, things can look really terrible. And it can even take a long time to create change. But our long-term trajectory in this country is progress. And I didn't want us to give up on making progress.
So slavery is a great example. I mean, it's not a great example of anything, but it's a great example
But it
of a fucking
illustrates, right, the problems that
country
we face as a nation.
that has really lost its way. What other moments?
So there's a Supreme Court case called Korematsu. It's a World War II era case. I'm a native Californian. I'm from Los Angeles. This was the story of many of my friends growing up, of their families.
I know.
Every Japanese American over the age of 14 gets declared an enemy alien during World War II. Absolutely no basis for that. Japanese people lose their homes, their businesses. They're interned in camps.
Yeah.
They essentially are just removed from their citizenship. And this is a tragic story. Fred Korematsu doesn't want to cave into this, and he ends up, after he's arrested for violating the ban on Japanese people not being in the stockade and the palisades, he sues. And ultimately, there's not a happy resolution of Japanese internment until Donald Trump, during his first presidency, invokes the Muslim ban.
Yeah.
And in the course of the Supreme Court signing off on the Muslim ban, the justices in dissent, Justice Kagan and Justice Sotomayor, make the point that what the Supreme Court is signing off on is just as bad as the Korematsu case, which denied Fred Korematsu's citizenship and participation in American citizenship. And Chief Justice Roberts only then, all of those decades later, says, no. Korematsu was wrongly decided. It was wrong when we did it. It's wrong now. It can't be the law in the United States of America. This is, I think, in many ways, a tragic sort of a reminder that the Supreme Court can get it right and take decades to fix it. But the reality is, again, in that situation, if we don't give up, there is a fix. And what happens if we just give up and walk away from democracy, right? All of the problems that we care about become that much more difficult to deal with, because when you have a king and his minions, if anything benefits people like you and me, Molly, and the rest of us, that's just an incidental benefit that happens to us, because for whatever reason, it doesn't conflict with the king's whims. If we want to be able to take on problems like climate change that are essential for future, then we have to remain a democracy. It's our only chance.
Yes. And Trump is not going to be some benevolent monarch. We've already seen that's not his play. So,
Yeah, I mean, I write in the book that king is a nice word for a dictator in this
right.
context.
We talk a lot about guardrails and how there aren't really guardrails in this moment. I think that the No Kings rally, second largest protest after Earth Day in 1991, when I was like 12, that is sort of the guardrail at this moment, is that we can be the guardrail. Do you think that's right? Like, because people are quick to dismiss that march and say, yeah, but what now? But I don't
Mhm.
think that's the right way to think about it. And I wonder what you think.
Yeah, so I totally agree. I think that we're the cavalry, right?
Yeah.
The public, we actually are a guardrail. We're a democratic institution in this country. There will be
Hmm.
elections in 2026. The fight will be to keep them free and fair. I
Yeah.
see the No Kings March as the summoning point for that effort to protect the vote. But I think there are other interesting guardrails that are reemerging. One of the
Tell
great
us.
things about our country, I think an advantage that we have over, for instance, countries like Hungary that were reemerging from communism and trying to establish democracy and then backslid. The advantage that we have is federalism. We have democracy at every
Mhm.
level of government, federal, state, local. It's so deeply ingrained that we elect our class presidents as elementary school kids in democratic fashion. And that means when there is a flunk out in the federal system, which is what we are experiencing right now, Congress supine on the floor, Supreme Court complicit in much of what Trump wants to do. Trump trying to gather all the power of government for the executive branch. And now we see governors reemerging and asserting themselves. The state's attorneys generals are one of the unsung songs of this
Mm.
moment because we have a
Yeah.
group of blue state Democratic attorneys general who are filing lawsuit after lawsuit. And these are high quality lawsuits. They've been strategic, they've been successful, they've blocked some of the worst Trump excesses. So I believe those guardrails are there if we're willing to look for them and support them. But yes, you're absolutely correct. Ultimately, we are the most important guardrail.
As someone who runs a podcast that does politics, I have interviewed a lot of Democratic attorneys general. So many so that sometimes I'm on TV and I'm like, it's Rob Bonta. I know that guy. It's Raul, my buddy Raul. I know that when I interviewed Raul from New Mexico, he's the attorney general of New Mexico, he actually said in July that he did not think Harris was going to win and that this crew had been meeting to try to figure out what the game plan was. These Democratic attorney generals have been have known that they have this responsibility. Talk to us about that, this sort of power of attorneys generals.
Yeah, so, especially in this moment that we're facing where the Supreme Court is making it more difficult to file lawsuits protecting the right to vote,
Hmm.
states' attorneys general are in a unique position because they will almost always either have the standing to challenge measures that are anti democratic or be able to support lawsuits that will advance those sorts of causes. And so you make the point about California's Attorney General Bontas. He's a legitimate constitutional law scholar. He's a lawyer's lawyer. In Rhode Island, Peter Nerona, my former U.S. attorney's colleague, an outstanding prosecutor, really doing a great job as an attorney general. Some of the cases have been situated in Rhode Island, and they've done very well. And so when we're seeing cases that support the rights of educational institutions or restore funding grants for public health, in many cases, that's the result of exactly what you've talked about: strategic moves by a group of attorneys general who saw that they were going to have the responsibility for acting in a uniquely coordinated fashion. And something I'm especially a fan of that they're doing is that they have shown restraint. They have not filed a lawsuit every single time the executive branch jumps. They wait for the good lawsuits. They file the good lawsuits. They focus their resources. They serve very well not only the people who've elected them, but all of us by doing that in a really strong fashion.
Yeah. Can we talk for a minute about what federalism looks like now? So you have a situation where, and I think Pritzker is such a good example, but could certainly make this example with California and Newsom. But I think Pritzker's a better example because Chicago is being
Yeah.
inundated with Trumpy fuckery. So here's a state pays in a lot of money to the federal government. In return, has programs canceled, has them held up, has them, is being treated in a way that federalism never meant to have
Right.
treated. What kind of power does the state of Illinois have? I mean, I asked Chris Murphy about this, and I think there's anxiety about upping the ante. But I also think if you are a state that's paying these humongous taxes and you find yourself a hostage of Donald Trump's America, like, how long until you decide that's not the move?
It's an incredibly ironic moment, right? I live in Alabama, the deep South. For years, we heard states' rights. We don't want the federal government interfering with the state's self management. There's even in the last couple of weeks been a little bit of a heartbeat from Republicans on that issue as we see Trump deploying, activating National Guardsmen and sending them into Democratic-led cities over claims that crime is rampant, which are, of course, untrue. I mean, that's the move, right? That effort to use power and override the states, which should have every Republican in the country in an uproar, and it doesn't. So states like my home state, Alabama, which pay far less in taxes than they receive in return from the
Right.
federal government, seem happy for that to be the case. And in essence, we're letting states like Illinois and California pay for a lot of that aid that comes back to our state. So I guess the question that you're asking is, at what point does it make sense for blue states to go to war with Donald Trump over that inequity? And I think that that's a question for the political types. So I'm going to duck a little bit since I'm a lawyer. But I will say at some point, blue state governors will need to consider whether it's worth crafting a legal strategy to challenge the way Donald Trump is using the power of the purse, which should, of course, belong to Congress and does belong to Congress if Congress chooses to assert it in order to address that situation. We've all seen these pictures, right, of Donald Trump tearing down part of the White House, which is just, I think,
Right.
horrifying at a cellular level to have to see. That's happening during a shutdown. Federal
Right.
employees are not getting paid. The government is not supposed to be spending money. And yet here we are. The question is, who's willing to step up and curb that abuse of power by the president?
A real important question. So, and I think that is a real question. And it's so far, it seems like no one except the libertarians. Talk to me about the libertarians. That's a weird dynamic. Were you surprised by that?
There's so much on the political spectrum that should be opposed to what Donald Trump is doing, right? We always hear that libertarian voice from Rand Paul, who still maintains that he's a fervent
Thomas
supporter of the
Massey.
president's,
Yeah.
but that he will step in when he disagrees with activity. And often that's on the libertarian end of the spectrum. Politics makes strange bedfellows, and I think it's not
Mm-hmm.
unlikely that we'll see a coalition reemerge that will try to constrain at least some of the spending, perhaps some of the tariff activity, which should offend those sensibilities. But we live in a moment where, and I think we just have to say this out loud, it's something that we've come to accept about Donald Trump and take for granted, where people simply don't push back in the way that they would if it was any other president, right? Imagine Barack Obama repainting a room in the White House, let alone cutting out a wall and tearing it down. There would be an uproar. It is time for us to start challenging our elected officials to ask them why they are not doing their jobs with regard to this president.
Is it illegal for Donald Trump to tear into the East Wing like that?
So I think illegal is a term of art. If you're asking, is it criminal? It's not, because the Supreme Court has said the president cannot
Can
commit a
do
crime when
whatever he
he's doing
wants.
official acts. Does that make it right? It's certainly, to the extent that it's lawful, it's awful. I think that there are civil challenges that could be brought against it. I'm surprised we haven't yet seen some group moving to enjoin what he's doing to the White House. It's certainly a travesty. And the way that I read it, this is just me personally, I see this as an expression from Donald Trump saying, I can do anything. I can even tear down the White House.
Yeah.
And my thought is, will no one with the power to do it in government step up and stop this man?
I think those pictures hurt Trump in a way that a lot of stuff hasn't. Like, I think people are really affected by those pictures.
I think it just cuts to the core. And I think, school kids who visited that building, folks who've worked there, members of Congress, I don't really know who is not offended by those
Right.
pictures. The
And it's
gilding in the Oval Office was bad enough. I think you're right. I think we've seen a number of steps, by the way, Molly, that may help people summon their moral courage and continue the work that was begun in the No Kings March. You know, there is this moment of physically tearing down the White House. There are revenge prosecutions underway, clear abuse of the criminal justice system. There's the prospect of absolutely outrageous insurance premiums in 2026 that will bankrupt people or prevent them from getting health care. All of this going on as Trump continues to glad handle and hold parties in the, whatever that parking lot pavement over the Rose Garden is. I think we've reached a turning point.
It's called the Rose Garden Club, and it's a
Mm,
Trump-branded property
mm.
where you or your Republican friends can order a delicious snack. Is that legal? That seems illegal.
So much of this would seem to violate common sense law, right? I mean, but do you remember the moment where they decided to hold the Republican convention in the White House for the 2020 election cycle? Clearly something that would violate the Hatch Act. And of course, the Hatch Act simply no longer matters because Donald Trump has decreed it so. And this is sort of the point that I make in the book. Donald Trump wants Americans to believe that his ascent to power is inevitable. In the last couple of weeks, we've seen the Trump 2028 nonsense that he's putting on his social media feeds. There was that picture of him in the Oval Office with a hat that said Trump 2028. And this is the thing about people who want to take control, people who want to be dictators. They will push as far as they can push until somebody stops them. This is the moment where instead of accepting that Trump is inevitable, he's literally waiting to see what we will do. But it can't be one and done. It has to be a continuous push. That means Americans talking to their elected officials and demanding more. That means preparing for the 2026 election because it's clear that Trump and his supporters will try to make it more difficult to vote. That may mean launching a sustained nationwide initiative to make sure that people have identification that proves that they're American citizens. It's expensive to get a passport. That's out of reach for a lot of people. We're going to have to come together to make sure that that happens so that every eligible citizen can vote no matter what hurdles they throw up. I mean, this is our moment as Americans. This is our battle. We're not going to fight on the shores in Normandy. We're going to fight on American soil in a peaceful way in voting booths to make sure that we don't lose our democracy.
And
Did you
everything
think
is
we'd
very
spend, a couple
stupid.
decades of our lives doing this? I mean, it's not what I planned to do in my 60s and
I
70s.
would also, I just want to add one fact check here, and I'm not really fact checking you. It's really just an aside. In 2028, Donald Trump will be 87 years old. Now, he is the fittest man to ever be president
He
ever
is, yes.
because of his fabulous Aryan genes.
Yes. I heard you make this point on MSNBC, I think, over the weekend, and I thought you were dead on the money. Joe Biden, all of the talk about his
So
declining mental health. And
Trump
we
is
are
older.
watching this with Donald
Yeah.
Trump every day, and there's not really much of a glimmer about it.
No. Yet. It is not. Thank you, Joyce. You are the best. I'm so happy.